20 years ago, benign deception was common. Since then, attitudes have undergone a complete about-face. Fortunately, clinicians have realized that patients usually know the truth anyway. On an unconscious and even on a conscious level, patients know what is going on in their bodies. Too many doctors today have gone from benign deception to a brutal honesty that also does more harm than good. I recently received a heartrending letter from a patient's wife explaining that her husband would not be keeping his second appointment with me because he had committed suicide. It was 2 days after he was told, with the most careless brutality, that he would never play tennis, captain a boat, or go to work again. All things he loved. All along, he had the most innocent faith in his doctors. Not that they could effect a cure, but that they were doing their best. They had no best. Far better to admit that the situation is grave, yet to remind the patient in truth that there is no incurable disease from which someone has not recovered, even at the threshold of death. When a doctor can instill some measure of hope, the healing process sometimes starts even before treatment begins. Dr. Alexandra Levine, a California oncologist, recently received a grant to study psychosocial aspects of cancer. She applied for it because of a similar experience. A man with extensive lymphoma was brought to her office. The patient's wife insisted he visit her before traveling all the way to Germany for a miracle cure he wanted to try. When Dr. Levine saw the panic in the man's eyes, she spent an hour simply calming and reassuring him. When he came back the next week, his tumors had shrunk by about half. She said, "I wish I had started your treatment last week." He told her, "You did." A sense of humor is an enormous asset, too. Many times when I'm in a room with a dying patient, we are laughing. Out in the hallway, the other staff members often think we are denying reality. We're simply still alive and thus able to laugh. Hospital personnel must realize that people aren't living or dying. They are either alive or dead. As long as they are alive, we must treat them that way. I find the word terminal terribly upsetting. It means we've begun to treat that person as though he or she were already dead. Studies have shown that it takes doctors and nurses longer to respond to the call button from a terminal patient's room than a button pressed by someone who is not labeled that way. The word implies a state of mind more than a physical condition, and it turns off the staff's empathy and ability to give the full measure of care needed. It also confronts them with their own mortality. It's also essential that patients know they can express anger to their physician without hurting the relationship. I've often heard people complain about their doctors, only to be asked not to mention it to them for fear of retribution in the future. Unexpressed anger hurts the patient and must be shared to establish a healing team. How poor the bond must be for a patient to believe that a doctor would not respond to criticism on a professional level. I'm happy when patients express anger at me because it means they feel safe with me, that we have a good relationship, and they are behaving like survivors. Unconscious awareness. Because of its effect on the patient, a doctor's attitude is often crucial to the success of treatment. One of the most important factors is a patient's confidence in having the doctor's undivided attention. I remember being in an operating room as an intern years ago with a patient under spinal anesthesia. Hearing only sports talk among the staff, he asked plaintively, "Won't someone please say something about me and my operation?" Picture the absurdity of a person with severe cancer having to listen to a technician worry about missing a hockey game or a doctor complain about being late to have her hair done. Only empathy can build the connection needed for healing. When a doctor sits down for 1 minute at the bedside to talk, the patient experiences it as 5 or 10 minutes. If the doctor stands in the doorway, the same visit seems like 15 seconds. Attitude counts even when the patient is unconscious, asleep, in coma, or under anesthesia. Milton Erickson, the great psychiatrist and hypnotherapist, showed in the early 1950s that voices known and meaningful to the patient were heard and understood during anesthesia. A Baltimore obstetrician once told me he had noticed a subtle change in his patient's behavior many years ago when the switch was made from ether to lighter anesthetics. To investigate, he brought a court stenographer into the operating room to record every word spoken during several cesarean sections. He found that under hypnosis, these patients could repeat the conversations word for word. For years, I've been utilizing the ability of unconscious patients to hear. I talked to persons in coma to let them know their medical status. In one case, I told a woman who had been in coma for 3 years with no signs of recovery that her family was giving her permission to go and that by dying she would not be a failure as a mother. I said they would miss her, but it was all right to let go if she wanted to. In 15 minutes she died. When I enter a room where a patient is sleeping, I simply announce myself softly and let his unconscious awareness awaken him if he wants to talk to me at that moment. If he doesn't wake up and there's no urgent problem, I return later. Several surgeons have now begun using the anesthetized mind's powers to help prevent complications. After lower back surgery, many people have trouble urinating and often need catheters because of spasms in the pelvic muscles. One group of researchers suggested to patients on the operating table that they would be able to relax the crucial muscles afterwards. None of these patients needed catheters. In the operating room, I'm constantly communicating with patients about what is happening, and I found that this can make the difference between life and death. Talking reassuringly to patients who are having cardiac irregularities during surgery can reverse the irregularities or slow a rapid pulse. Recently, I was operating on a very husky young man built like a football player. His size led to some minor technical problems, and while solving them, I looked up at the monitor and saw that his pulse was 130. I knew that he had been anxious about the operation, so I said to him, "Victor, I'm having some mechanical difficulties because you're a big guy, but there's no problem with the surgery. This part is just a little difficult to do. You're doing well. Don't be nervous. I'd like your pulse to be 83. During the next few minutes, without any other medication, his pulse came right down to 83 and remained there. Many anesthesiologists who've heard of such episodes have begun speaking to their anesthetized patients, giving them calming messages. Fear-filled messages can increase the incidence of cardiac arrest. Once, as I finished a difficult emergency abdominal operation on a young, very obese man, his heart stopped. He didn't respond to resuscitation. The anesthesiologist had given up and was walking out the door when I spoke out loud into the room. "Harry, it's not your time yet. Come on back." At once, the cardiogram began to show electrical activity, and the man ultimately recovered fully. I can't prove it, of course, but I am sure the verbal message made the difference. I know the experience made believers out of the other staff members who were present, and there is certainly no reason not to communicate with a patient in every possible way. It's especially important to avoid negative messages because the anesthetized patient's conscious defense mechanisms aren't functioning. I always make sure that operating room personnel don't say anything they wouldn't say if the patient were awake. When a surgeon makes a quip like, "If he ever leaves here, it'll be feet first," it's no wonder the patient wakes up crying in the recovery room. One can be honest about the diagnosis and still implant positive thoughts about the future treatment. A simple statement like, "You'll wake up comfortable, thirsty, and hungry," modified for obese patients, will promote recovery. Even the desire to smoke can be reduced by a suggestion at the end of the operation. I also do not hesitate to ask the patient not to bleed if circumstances call for it. It's well known that yogis and hypnotized subjects can control bleeding, and the verbal request also seems to work during anesthesia. The ambience of the clinical environment influences the attitude of both doctor and patient. I fear that we lost one of our most important sources of strength, a connection to God and nature, when hospital planners took the windows out. A view of the outside world reminds us of our link to all life, helping us survive. Recent research at a hospital in Pennsylvania showed that patients whose rooms faced an open courtyard, a tree, and the sky got well faster than those whose rooms faced a brick wall.